Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the National Archives, whether you're here in person in the McGowan Theater or joining us by YouTube, and a special welcome to our C-SPAN audience. Before we begin today's program with Michael Blanding, I'd like to alert you to two other programs coming up soon in the McGowan Theater. Tonight at 7 o'clock, we're hosting Lincoln scholar Harold Holzer, who will talk about his new book, Lincoln and the Power of the Press, The War for Public Opinion. Newseum journalist Frank Bond will join him in a discussion about President Lincoln and Civil War journalism. And on Monday, October 27th at 7 p.m., we'll be showing the film Codebreaker, a docudrama about Alan Turing, the British mathematical genius who broke the German Enigma code during World War II. Following the screening, Patrick Salmon, the film's executive producer, will discuss the film and answer questions. And you should definitely put next week's virtual genealogy fair on your calendar. For 3 days, October 28th through the 30th, you'll be able to learn and ask questions about family history resources in the federal records through sessions broadcast over the internet. All the details are on archives.gov. Just search for Genealogy Fair. To learn more about these and all of our programs, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online. There are copies in the lobby as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. The Map Thief, wrote Michael Washburn of the Boston Globe, offers a brisk, engaging introduction to the slippery world of rare maps and map stewardship. In concluding his review, Washburn states, "Maps project wishful thinking. The Map Thief is a masterful cartography of a man who fell victim to such wishful thinking, destroying his life." As a rival dealer said about Smiley, "You're talking about a person who defiled the institutions that defined his existence." Smiley is E. Forbes Smiley III, who stole an unknown number of maps from prominent research institutions for years before he was caught. The quotation comes from the rival dealer, hits home for those of us who work in and use libraries and archives, because criminals like Smiley do defile the institutions whose trust they have cultivated. They've betrayed that trust, damaged our shared cultural heritage, and caused irreparable losses to future scholarship. I have a particular interest in Forbes Smiley's story because he stole more than 70 maps from the New York Public Library over many years, the last five of which I was the director of libraries there. He was a long-standing trusted friend there, as he was at the other institutions he victimized, such as Harvard, the Boston Public Library, and Yale. While Smiley only admitted to stealing 97 maps, we estimate the loss at more than double that figure. Here at the National Archives, we have not been immune to this type of theft. Just 2 years ago, Barry Landau was sent to prison for robbing cultural institutions of thousands of documents, including speeches from the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library. We take our responsibility as the nation's record keeper very seriously. We take precautions to prevent theft, but we also rely on the alert eyes and ears of our researchers, as well as our staff, to protect the records. Our archival recovery team, operating under the Office of Inspector General here, tracks down missing items and asks citizens to report if they have seen lost or stolen items. Now let's turn to Michael Blanding for the story of E. Forbes Smiley and his descent from noted dealer to notorious map thief. Michael Blanding is the author of The Coke Machine, The Dirty Truth Behind the World's Favorite Soft Drink, and a journalist with more than 15 years of experience. Previously a staff writer and editor at Boston Magazine, Blanding has since freelanced for publications including The Nation, The New Republic, Consumer's Digest, and the Boston Globe magazine, where he has focused on investigative stories involving intensive research and interviews. He's been named a senior fellow at the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis University and a network fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. An amateur map lover, Blanding has a collection of international subway maps and bought his first antiquarian map while reporting this book. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Blanding.
Thank you all so much for coming here this afternoon. I'm particularly pleased to be giving this talk here at the National Archives, such a wonderful repository of old books and manuscripts. And in the reporting of this book, I became a great lover of archives, going to the institutions that Smiley ended up taking rare maps out of. I got to see a lot of these old documents myself, and there's really nothing like actually seeing an original document and being able to touch it with your fingers and see it with your own eyes, and it's really a wonderful service that buildings like this provide in providing access to these materials. So I'm just going to dive right in here with a reading from the beginning of my book. I start with the first sentence from the first chapter, so there's nothing you need to know going in. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the strange character of Forbes Smiley, who I got to know very well over the past 3 years, and then show you some images of some of the maps that he stole, particularly focusing on the Virginia and Washington, D.C. area. So let me dive right in here. This is the beginning of my book, The Map Thief. E. Forbes Smiley III couldn't stop coughing. No matter how much he tried to suppress it, the tickle in the back of his throat kept breaking out into a hacking cough, drawing glances from the patrons sitting around him. The glass fishbowl of a reading room at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University was quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the clicking of fingers on keyboards, making Smiley painfully aware of the noise he was making. At one point, he pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket to muffle the sound, and as he did, an X-Acto knife blade wrapped inside fell softly onto the carpeted floor. He folded the cloth and put it back in his pocket, oblivious to what had just happened. Smiley was in the Beinecke this morning to study some rare atlases in preparation for the London Map Fair, an annual gathering of hundreds of map collectors who came to the British capital to buy, sell, and trade antiquarian maps. When people thought of Forbes Smiley, as he was universally known by friends, dealers, librarians, and clients, a few words inevitably sprang to mind: gregarious, jolly, larger than life. He spoke with the resonance of an Italian tenor, mangled by a nasally, waspish affectation. His voice, like Daisy Buchanan's, was full of money. When he made phone calls, he made sure to announce that he was calling from the vineyard. His upper crust affectations, however, were tempered by a charming self-deprecation. He'd ingratiated himself with many a librarian by inquiring after her spouse or children, and reciprocated with entertaining stories of travel around the world or the progress of the new home he was building on Martha's Vineyard. Most of all, people thought of his laugh. For years, friends had reveled in Smiley's laugh, which rolled up out of his belly and racked his body in a cackle that only increased in volume the longer it went on. It was the kind of laugh that in college had earned him free tickets from theater producers, who sat him in the front row to egg on the audience. And it generally caused people to excuse the pretension that crept into his voice when he was expounding on any of his obsessions: architecture, New England history, the blues, and of course, maps. Whether they liked him or not, his colleagues and rivals in the map business had all been seduced by his knowledge, which in certain areas exceeded that of anyone else in the world. On the morning of June 8, 2005, however, none of the librarians at the Beinecke's Public Services desk recognized him. Had they known him, they would have been shocked at the transformation he'd undergone. In addition to the cough that had developed overnight, he was suffering from a splitting headache left over from a night of drinking. Smiley had been drinking a lot these days. It was the only thing that took his thoughts away from problems that multiplied in his mind whenever he was sober. As gifted as he was at remembering details about maps, he was abysmal at managing the details of the business through which he earned his livelihood. No matter how entertaining his stories, the truth was that he was overextended and hemorrhaging money. As studious as he looked, he was feeling a fresh sense of desperation by the time he left to get lunch around 11. Sitting in a coffee shop around the corner, he turned his options over in his mind. He could take the train to New York today and fly to London a day early in hopes of putting together a deal before the map fair began. Or he could abandon the whole plan and head back to the vineyard, saving the expense and hoping to find another way out of his financial mess. While he sat pondering his predicament without reaching a conclusion, the situation in the reading room had changed radically in his absence. Smiley may have missed the X-Acto knife blade that fell from his pocket, but a librarian named Naomi Sato had not. The Beinecke's librarians make regular sweeps of the room to ensure materials are handled properly and to subtly alert patrons they are being watched. As Sato had entered to make her check, she immediately spied the blade on the floor. Few objects could be more disturbing to someone who works in a building full of rare books than a tool that can separate the pages of a book from its binding. Saito picked up the blade and a tissue and walked back out of the room. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavor for how I start the book, and also a flavor for this character of Forbes Smiley, who, as I say, I got to know very well in all of his contradictions. Even though that's the beginning of my book, it was the end of the story for Forbes Smiley. That day, as the librarians found the X-Acto knife blade, they began Googling the patrons and the names of the patrons in the library, and discovered that Forbes Smiley was a dealer in rare maps. And this, of course, made them even more nervous. And so they called the Yale Police Department, and as Smiley left the library, a plainclothes police officer was following close behind. And this is a map that I made for the book. I say that I made it. I actually thought that originally I was going to make my own maps for the book. I thought if I was going to write a book about maps, I should have some of my own maps in it. But it only took me about 10 minutes of drawing on paper to realize that that just wasn't going to happen. So I hired a illustrator who happened to be from the Netherlands, which I was very pleased by, because the Netherlands was where the golden age of map making was in the 1500s and 1600s. But this is a map that he drew of the Yale University campus, and you can see right up here at the top is the Beinecke Library, and Smiley walked down the street past the Sterling Memorial Library, past the iconic Harkness Tower, all the way to the Yale British Arts Center. And it was there that the police officer introduced himself and said he was with the library, and asked if Smiley had perchance inadvertently taken anything with him. And Smiley, even though he was under no obligation to cooperate, he decided that he would go back with this officer to the Beinecke, and they began looking through his things. And first they looked through his briefcase, and they found a number of rare maps there, but Smiley said that he had brought those with him, and they found no evidence to show that that wasn't true. And then as he was standing there, they noticed him sort of fidgeting with his blazer pocket and something in his blazer, and they asked him to take it out. And when they did, he took out this. This is a map of New England by John Smith. It was originally done in 1616, and this is actually Yale's copy that was done in 1631. And I just want to pause for a moment and tell you a little bit about this map and explain what makes it so important and what makes it so valuable. So we all know of John Smith from the Virginia colony down the street from here, and his role in founding that starting in 1607. But he had sort of a second chapter in his life after he was sort of drummed out of Virginia for reasons that I won't go into. He started exploring this area that was then just known as North Virginia, with the idea of founding a new colony there. And he thought that it needed a snappier name, so he came up with the name New England. And John Smith was actually the person who coined that term as a way to claim this territory for his home country and sort of tell the other countries, you know, this is English territory. And he also wanted to claim this territory for himself and make sure that he got credit for discovering it and that he was going to be involved in its colonization. And so he put an enormous portrait of himself up here in the corner. And he was so vain that he actually updated the portrait over the years on different versions of the map. So this is a later version of the map, and you can see his beard is much bushier than earlier versions, and his jacket is much more elaborately decorated. The other interesting thing about this map is that you probably can't see it from there, but all up and down the coastline here are names of English towns and cities. London is there, and Cambridge and Oxford and other places. And of course, in 1616, before the Pilgrims landed in New England, none of those cities or towns existed. And the reason that they're there on the map is because after he made the map, he brought it to England, and he presented it to Prince Charles at the time and asked him to change the names of all of the Native American settlements to English towns and cities. And so it was this sort of breathtaking act of virtual colonization that occurred before a single English settler had actually set foot in the territory. And it did succeed in claiming the territory for England. And interestingly, most of the towns and cities on the map have since disappeared, or at least they're not in the places that he put them. but one of them has remained. Right down here in the corner, you can see where he wrote Plymouth. And that was actually where the Pilgrims, when they sailed from Plymouth with a copy of Smith's map in hand on the Mayflower, they steered to that location and they founded their colony there and took the name for the Plymouth colony. So this is a really important map. It's a really seminal document in the founding and exploration of North America. And it's also a quite rare map. So even though it's not a one-of-a-kind, there's only a few dozen copies of this map that exist in various institutions throughout the country and the world. And because of that, it's a very valuable map. So at auction, this map could go easily for $50,000 to a map collector. And so when Smiley was found with this map that was both rare and valuable, one of the librarians at the time noticed the handwriting at the bottom of the map and recognized it as belonging to a patron of Yale who had donated a lot of rare books and maps to the library. And so she immediately cried out, "That's our map." And they put handcuffs on Smiley and led him away to spend the night in jail. So the FBI was called in to investigate this case. And immediately they realized that they had a problem. So as I mentioned, there may have been only a few dozen copies of this map, but it's not so rare that there's only one copy. It's not like a work of art in a museum, for example, where there's only one copy of it, and if it's missing from the wall, then everyone knows that it was stolen. An FBI agent came in and said, I understand that Smiley had a copy of this map, that you are missing a copy of this map, but how do I know that the copy that you're missing is the copy that Smiley took? And they actually got lucky very early on in the case with another map that Smiley had on him that day. And it's this one. This is a map by Gerard de Jode, and he was one of those Dutch map makers that I was talking about from the 1500s. And this is the world map from his atlas, which is even more rare than the Smith map. It was only produced in the first edition of his atlas, which never sold very well in the first place, and very few copies of this map survive. It's probably worth about $150,000 at least at auction. And so it wasn't what was on the front of this map that interested investigators, though. It was what was on the back of this map. So you can see that on the back of the map there were these four little wormholes that had been made by these parasitic pests probably hundreds of years ago as it was sitting on the dusty shelf of a library. And the four holes on the map lined up exactly with four holes in the atlas that was in Yale's collection that Smiley was looking at that day. And so this was as good as a fingerprint to investigators. It was sort of this cartographic CSI that they were able to really catch him red-handed and say, yes, he took this map, and yes, it came from this volume belonging to Yale. And because it was an object worth over $100,000, they could charge him with a federal crime of theft of an object of cultural heritage, which carries a hefty federal sentence. And so the FBI agent, now that they knew that Smiley had stolen at least two maps and probably more, the FBI agent began to further investigate the case. And even though he knew nothing about rare maps when he started working on the case, he did know a lot about thieves. And he knew that when a thief is caught red-handed, it's usually not the first time that they've committed a theft. And so he began calling around and sending emails out to other rare book and manuscript libraries around the country. And he asked them two questions. Has Forbes Smiley been in your collection lately? And are you missing any rare maps? And 6 institutions answered yes to both of those questions. At Yale University, both the Sterling and the Beinecke were missing maps. The Boston Public Library, the New York Public Library, which was missing maps from 2 divisions, the Map Division and the Rare Books Division, the Houghton Library at Harvard, the British Library in London, and the Newberry Library in Chicago. And so now it became this sort of treasure hunt where the investigators had to determine what maps were missing from the libraries, what books Smiley looked at, which maps he may have taken, and where those maps may have ended up. And it became quite an ordeal. The libraries had to go back in many cases through hundreds of call slips dating back several years to find which items Smiley had looked at, and then compare them to their catalogs for those items, And oftentimes, as you can imagine, with these rare books that are acquired, over 100 years ago, they were not very accurately cataloged in terms of what maps they contain. And so some of them might just say map or maps. Some of them may list some maps but not others. Some of them may have said they had a map, but they're missing it long before Smiley got there. So it was really this difficult enterprise that they had to go in to figure out the extent of his crimes. Lucky for them, he did come forward when he heard that there were federal charges pending against him. Smiley did come forward and he offered to cooperate. As David said, he eventually admitted stealing 97 maps, but the libraries to this day accuse him of stealing more than he admitted, and I'll get to that in a moment and show you some examples of that. The maps that he stole were worth over $3 million in total, so they were the creme de la creme of antique maps, the most expensive, most valuable maps that he stole. And so all this happened in 2005, 2006. And this was all had been reported in the newspapers. It was all pretty well known by the time that I started on this trail in 2011. I remember reading about this case in the New Yorker and other places when it happened. I've always been a map lover myself, and I was always very intrigued by these rare objects and the fact that people were willing to pay thousands and tens of thousands of dollars for them. It made me curious to know more about why that was the case. But I also wanted to know more about Smiley, and he had never talked to the press before. He'd never given an interview. He'd never explained why he started taking these maps, especially given the fact that he was himself a rare map dealer and by all accounts loved these maps and celebrated them. What was it that caused him to go to the dark side, as it were, and start actually taking these maps out of libraries? And so that is the task that I set for myself. Originally, I was going to write an article for Boston Magazine and kind of update the case and kind of tell it start to finish. And through a friend of Smiley's, he actually agreed to talk to me. And I sat across a picnic table on Martha's Vineyard for 4 hours when he told me his story. And by the end of that 4 hours, I was just completely convinced that this was not a magazine article, that this was a book. That he was just such a complex character, and this world of map dealers and map collectors was so interesting. And finally, the stories of the map makers themselves many times were just as interesting as Smiley's story, if not more so. So I'm just going to share a little bit about what I learned about both Smiley and about some of these maps that he stole. This is another map that I had made for the book of New England, showing some of the key locations in the story. But Smiley actually grew up in this little town in New Hampshire called Bedford. And despite his highfalutin name, E. Forbes Smiley III, he actually grew up middle class as the son of an electrical engineer. He didn't come from these vast pools of wealth that you might imagine. But he was always fascinated with history. Even as a young boy, he would read about history and study the history of the area, particularly the history of New England. And he went to college in Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. And he made history a specialty, history and religion, and he was known for all sorts of eccentric things like reciting the Iliad in the middle of campus, or taking a walk and telling his friends about every church steeple that they passed and the history of the architecture of that church. After college, he settled in New York, and it was there that he entered the map trade. And he started at this department store, B. Altman's department store, which no longer exists, but it had a small division that sold rare maps and atlases. And it was conveniently located just a dozen blocks from the New York Public Library, and that's where his real education in maps began. And he became so fascinated by looking at the different maps and comparing them to each other and realizing which map maker had copied from whom. And he just couldn't get enough of this topic, and just became incredibly knowledgeable in a very short period of time. And originally, as he went on his own as a map dealer, he was quite successful. The late 1980s was a very good time to become a map dealer because the prices of maps were suddenly just increasing exponentially. And people, even wealthy people, were no longer able to afford a lot of fine art. The prices for that had just become unattainable. So maps became a new way of collecting for folks who were, wealthy but not billionaires. People, doctors, lawyers, Wall Street executives. who would buy these rare maps, put them on their walls, and have, if not a one-of-a-kind item, a very rare item that was beautiful to look at and also had this historical story behind it. And so they became very popular, and maps that went for a couple of $1,000s went for tens of thousands of dollars, and eventually approaching hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Smiley was very successful in riding this wave for quite a while. He put together a collection of maps of the New York and Mid-Atlantic region, including Washington and Virginia, for a man by the name of Larry Slaughter, which was donated to the New York Public Library as the Slaughter Collection of Maps, and it's there today. He also put together a collection of maps of Boston and New England for a developer in Boston named Norman Leventhal, and that's been contributed to the Boston Public Library as the Leventhal Collection of Maps. Both of those particularly ironic given later events and the fact that he was taking maps out of those very libraries that he was putting them into. As I discovered, though, Smiley, even though he was very successful in putting together these collections and in selling maps for quite a while, he also had several flaws that were really his undoing. One of them was that he was just a terrible business person. Starting from the very beginning, he was always sort of chasing maps that he couldn't afford and buying one map in order to pay for another one. He became really notorious for bouncing checks to his fellow dealers, and some of them stopped doing business with him and hurt his client base. And then, in addition, as maps became more valuable in the 1980s, there was also a lot more competition that ensued. And so a number of new map dealers came in, and they really looked at it as a business. And we may think of map dealing and collecting as this sort of rarefied pursuit of people studiously studying in libraries, but it's actually quite a business, in some ways a cutthroat business of people bidding against each other at auctions for a very small number of very rare and valuable items. And a number of these map dealers didn't like Smiley very much, either because he bounced checks to them or because they just thought him sort of arrogant and sort of a know-it-all, and so they would bid up against him in auction and sometimes drive the price up on him. Sometimes they would band together against him. And lastly, Smiley was just never a team player. He was always had this sort of secretive, kind of go-it-alone attitude that he was just going to make it on his own 2 feet, and he didn't need anyone else's help. And again, that contributed to his financial problems because it was really necessary sometimes for different dealers to sort of band together in bidding on certain items that they would then split up. And so he became even less able to compete because of that. And eventually, as he told me, he was too proud to sort of admit that he had failed in this pursuit. And he told me that he was looking at a map at the Sterling Memorial Library on the table in front of him, realizing that he could fold it down to the size of a credit card, walk out with it in his pocket, and sell it the next day for $30,000. And that was the moment when temptation got the better of him. He sold that first map and may have told himself that it was just this one-time thing that he was going to do and get out of his financial duress. But of course, that started a slippery slope, and he began stealing more and more maps and selling them for more and more money, and became the map thief that I write about in my book. I'm just going to talk about a few of the maps that he stole, just to give you an idea of the kind of items that he took and why they're valuable and what he did with them when he took them. This is another map by John Smith. It's actually a map that he made a few years before his map of New England, and it's a map of the Virginia colony. And it's a particularly striking map because John Smith had very rudimentary surveying materials. He went up and down Chesapeake Bay and the rivers in a very small boat, and just had a sextant that he would use to take sights on different landmarks. And from that, he was able to create this very accurate map of the region that was in use as a map for 200 years after he created it. And as you can see on this map, he did not put a picture of himself. He put a picture of the Native American chief Powhatan in the corner, and this picture of another Native American here. The there's little crosses at some areas along the rivers that he put there, and scholars today think that that was the limits of the area that he actually individually surveyed himself, and the point past that was areas that he actually relied upon the knowledge of the natives of the area to map the rest of the area, and you can see how accurate that is as well. So it's particularly successful and really quite amazing that he was able to do the job he was on this. This is a map that, and Smiley stole, well, there were 2 copies of this map that were missing from the Boston Public Library. And when Smiley admitted the maps that he had taken, he only admitted to stealing 1. And interestingly enough, the librarian afterwards did not give up on this. He was sure that Smiley had taken the other one as well, and he began scanning dealers' catalogs and actually saw a copy of this map, and went down to New York with the book that the map was missing from, and was able to match that map against the book by a little impression that was made in the page on the that was facing where the map was missing. So that's at least one map that Smiley did not admit to that was eventually recovered by the library. This is another map of Virginia. You can see Chesapeake Bay here. So in the Smith map, you can see that north is actually to the right. And then on this map, north is at the top, but you can see the Chesapeake Bay and the Appalachian Mountains here. And this map was sort of the definitive map of the 18th century of the Virginia and Washington area. And it was all done from original surveys by Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson. And if you're wondering if that Jefferson has any relation to Thomas Jefferson, he was actually his father. And after Peter Jefferson died, he bequeathed his surveying equipment to Thomas Jefferson, who actually created some maps of his own, including one map of Virginia. But this map was made in response to the growing tensions between the French and the English. So as the colonists move inward into the mountains, they began running up against the French, who were sort of coming down from Canada. And eventually that would erupt in the French and Indian War. But for almost 100 years before war actually broke out, there was sort of this cartographic war that went on between the English and the French, with them both drawing competing maps in order to claim the territory of the Ohio Valley and into Virginia. And so this map was actually commissioned in order to survey this area here where these competing claims were taking place, and was leaps ahead of any maps for the time, and was the most accurate map into the Revolutionary War. As I said, this was Thomas Jefferson's father, and Thomas Jefferson used this map as well to create his own maps. This map was taken from the Boston Public Library. It was part of a atlas of maps of the United States that was made in 1775, right around the time of the American Revolution, and this is one that Smiley took out of that atlas. I just wanted to show you a few maps of Washington, D.C. as well, since that's where we are today. So this is a map that was made in 1792. It was the first printed map of Washington, D.C., and it was made by Andrew Ellicott, who was the assistant of Charles L'Enfant, who many of you have no doubt heard of. L'Enfant Plaza is just a few blocks from here. L'Enfant was the one who designed Washington, D.C., and designed it on a model of Paris and these sort of grand boulevards that would go through the center of the city. And unfortunately, he put one of those boulevards through one of the property of one of the main landowners at the time, and he wasn't all that thrilled about it, and complained to Washington and Jefferson, who were in charge of plans for the Capitol, and L'Enfant was dismissed. And so it fell to Ellicott to continue his plans and actually put them into practice. And he finished the surveying and produced a series of maps of Washington, D.C. And the first published map was done in June of 1792 but there were two sort of pirated versions that appeared in magazines before the official map was ever printed. And this map that you're looking at was actually in a magazine that was printed in Boston. And it's incredibly rare. The other map was in a magazine in Philadelphia. That one's more common. The Boston map is incredibly rare. And after Smiley's thefts were discovered, both Harvard and the Boston Public Library were both missing their copy of the Ellicott map from the edition of that magazine. And of course, Smiley only admitted stealing one copy of this map. And so after the maps were recovered, a number of the libraries all went down to New Haven and to look at the maps and determine whose was whose. So they had a little bit of a fight over some of these maps, and being librarians, it was of course a quiet fight, but there was a lot of maps that changed hands and that went to different institutions who were able to prove through different marks in the map or different impressions or things whose was whose. And this actually was proven to be Harvard's copy of this map. So the Boston Public Library is still missing their edition. This is the last map I want to show you. This is also by Ellicott, and it was also of Washington, D.C. But as you can see, it's a very different looking map. And it was meant to be displayed in this diamond-shaped like this. And as you can see, it's all of the topography of Washington, D.C. sort of stripped of the landmarks and the street names. And this one is also quite rare. And after Smiley's thefts were revealed, Yale University, the Sterling Library there, realized that they were missing their copy. And Smiley actually listed a copy of this map on his website, and in that listing mentioned that he knew of no versions of this map that had come up at auction since 1991, when he had actually helped purchase it for the Slaughter Collection, which ended up at New York Public Library. But as I said, Yale was missing their copy of this map. And right around the time it was on Smiley's website, the map also appeared in the catalog of a dealer that Smiley was known to do business with. But Smiley never admitted stealing this one, and Yale didn't have any kind of defining marks that would show that this is actually their map. They didn't have a digital image of it. They didn't have any other kinds of evidence. And so because of that, the FBI decided that it wasn't a map that Smiley had stolen, and it was never returned and never recovered back to Yale. So I just wanted to close with a few words about what Smiley did with the money that he gained from stealing these maps. Because in some ways I find this to be one of the more compelling aspects of the story, and one of the things that really convinced me that there was a book here. This is a map of a small town up in Maine called Sebec. And it is a little flea bite of a town. You can barely even find it on a map in far northern Maine. And Smiley purchased a farmhouse here in the late 1980s, right up here. And given his love of history, and particularly his love of New England, he restored this farmhouse lovingly to his image of the perfect, ideal New England farmhouse. But he didn't stop there. He decided that he was going to restore the rest of the town as well. And he began buying up property, including the post office and a restaurant, a general store. He renovated this children's park with this gazebo. And about half the people in town looked at him as this Robin Hood figure come in to save their economic prospects. He employed carpenters, laborers, people that worked in his shops and his stores. All in all, spent about $1 million on this project of renovating this town. Of course, the other half of the town wasn't all that pleased about some New Yorker coming up to Maine and telling them what to do with their town and how to run their property. And so a number of residents of the town got into a feud with him. Particularly the folks across the street from him on the lake was a family known as named the Moriartys. And they decided they had a different version of the town that they would like to see, and it involved an ice cream shop and a speedboat marina and sort of this pleasure boating center. And the two of them really came at odds and started this feud that really divided the whole town in half. so that half of the people would eat at Smiley's restaurant and mail letters from his post office. The other half would go to the town next door and send their letters there and eat at the restaurant in that town. And it eventually grew into this legal battle that ended up costing Smiley even more money in legal bills on top of the money he was already spending on this renovation project and all the people he was employing and the debts that he had had in the first place. And it caused him to rapidly increase the pace of his stealing in the last 6 months and target new areas, including the Beinecke Library, where he was eventually caught. So that gives you just a little bit of sense of who this character was and the interesting contradictions involved in his tale. As I mentioned, he did steal upwards of 100 maps that we know of. As David said, the libraries accused him of stealing at least 150 more. He did spend 3 years in prison, which a lot of the libraries wish that he had spent more of a jail term, but he was given time off for the cooperation that he provided to the FBI. He currently lives on Martha's Vineyard, where last I knew he was working as a landscaper for $12 an hour. He has nothing to do with rare maps anymore, but in prison he did pick up a new hobby of watercolor painting. And this is a picture of a watercolor that was on display at an art show at Martha's Vineyard that I attended. And it just goes to show you how talented a person he is, that just in a few short years was able to produce a watercolor of this caliber. But as you can see on the label, there's one change since his map dealing days. He no longer goes by the name E. Forbes Smiley III. Now he goes by Edward and sometimes even Ed. So thank you all so much for coming, and I really hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions. There's some microphones here in the aisles. If you have a question, please come up to the mic.
Thank you very much. Informational and then more general. The boulevard in D.C. and the landowner, and then a more general, and I realize this isn't necessarily your area of authority, but how well are institutions doing these days, in your opinion, of protecting their goods?
The first question about, so your question is
in Washington.
More about what boulevard and what
was the boulevard and who was the property owner? You said somebody.
That I can't tell you. I
Okay.
once knew that during my research, but there's so many maps and so many details that some of them have escaped me.
Comment on how institutions, in your opinion, are doing these days in terms of protecting their materials.
That I can comment on because I looked quite a bit into that, and particularly the libraries that Smiley targeted have done a lot to change their security practices. They've installed new cameras. They have in some cases installed new policies for how maps are delivered to patrons. For example, Yale has a barcode affixed now to every single map, and it's scanned in and out of the vault every time someone wants to look at it. Other libraries have instituted digital imaging so that if, God forbid, a map is gone missing, that they can identify it and tell that it's their map. On the other hand, as you know, libraries are chronically short-staffed and underfunded, and so there's a real variation between libraries and what they've done and what they've been able to do. And there wasn't a single curator who I spoke to who said that this couldn't happen again somewhere. As long as we're providing access to these materials, unless we want to lock them all up and just provide digital images to people, which I think would be a real shame, you're going to assume some measure of risk, and the question is how much risk are you able to minimize? Thank you. Sure.
I have a question over here. I got a sense in reading your book at the end that a number of libraries weren't really forthcoming in the maps that they were missing, and I was kind of wanted to get your feel for why they felt that way.
Yeah, there's a real variety of the amount of transparency that libraries were able to show, and in some cases that's understandable. You can imagine that if you are looking for donations of material from people, you don't want to be necessarily advertising the fact that you have had items stolen from your institution. Unfortunately, that also plays into some of these thefts by Smiley and other people, and allows them to continue because of the fact that these thefts aren't widely disseminated. It sometimes can allow them to go on a lot longer than they otherwise would have. So there's a real tension that exists there, and to their credit, I think libraries have gotten better about that and have become more transparent since the Smiley affair. I was impressed in my research at just how transparent the libraries were with me, and many of them just opened up all of their files and really were incredibly open in the information they gave me. But there still is that secrecy that exists in terms of these thefts that can help aid and abet the thieves.
I think there must be a commonality between the market for these maps and old books or antiquities, in that there's almost a black market that people ignore from where those maps come from. How it would be possible for people to buy these things when they've come from Yale or whatever. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that black market and how things can be sold so easily when they're so, while they're have been stolen. Is there nothing, do you not have to say what the precedent is and where they got them? Obviously, the answer is no.
Yeah, it's really interesting. As I started to research this issue and find out how these maps are bought and sold, a lot of people ask me, is there some kind of black market where they're selling these things, to some fence or something, and then it's, ending up in this private collection in Japan or something. And it's actually, unlike art thefts of rare maps and books can be done quite out in the open, because there are multiple copies of these things. So Smiley would go primarily to 3 dealers that he'd worked with for a number of years, and he would say that he was selling off maps that were in a collection of an old Boston dealer or old Boston collector, and he was going to be coming to them with very rare material over the next few months. And those dealers bought that story, they believed him, and they bought these maps and then sold them on to other collectors, and they put them right on their wall in full display. And there's definitely some criticism of whether those dealers should have asked more questions and whether they should have accepted Smiley's story at face value. At the same time, it's very difficult in some cases to actually prove the provenance of these maps. Once you go back a couple of decades, it can be sometimes hard, even if you know that it was sold at auction, in the 1990s, then you've got to ask sort of when was it sold before that, and going back, more than 2 or 3 steps is often very hard. And so I think there has been a lot more effort on the part of dealers to look at provenance and not just to take the seller's word at face value, but I think that is one of the issues inherent in the field that
There
again
doesn't
sort of
seem
aids
to
and
be
abets the
any
thieves.
no shame either. It's the wanting to acquire it overcomes the possibility that perhaps it was taken from Yale Library. It just astounds me, but I mean,
I
that's
certainly think
yeah.
that's the case in some cases, that there's sort of this willful ignorance that appears where you don't ask too many questions because you don't want to know the answers to them. But I don't think that represents everybody in the field, but certainly some of that does go on.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I just wanted to answer the question that the gentleman raised a few minutes ago about the location of that.
Oh, nice.
The mansion that got torn down was owned by one of the 3 commissioners, the original commissioners, Daniel Carroll, the brother and other relations of the Charles Carroll of Carrollton and so forth. Big landowner. And the mansion was located at the intersection of what is now New Jersey Avenue and Independence Avenue, basically in the front yard of the Capitol building. And L'Enfant knew where the land, what land was his to play with and what land was still private land. He knew that was his land. Carroll ignored him. So he, just to prove his point, L'Enfant went in the dead of night with his workmen and tore that building down just to prove that it was his. And that's what helped to contribute to his dismissal.
So wonderful. Thank you so much for telling that story. And just goes to show you, the story behind some of these maps that, politics was alive and well in D.C. even before the city of D.C. was actually created here. Over here.
I'm wondering how much his watercolors sell for, and is there possibly a future for him in that field?
I don't know. That art show was part of a grant that the Island Cultural Commission gave money to different artists to display their work. I think maybe he made like $2,000 or something. But certainly, I don't know if it has occurred to him that he could sell E. Forbes Smiley originals and profit just from the name alone. But to my knowledge, he hasn't gone and actually sold any of his work.
Hi. First, thanks for an engaging talk. Just two quick questions. If there were a movie on the Edward Smiley story, who do you see playing Mr. Smiley, since you know him that well? And secondly, with the Archivist of the United States sitting right in front of you, if you could procure any map in any way without punishment in the world, what would that be?
Got to be careful what I say here.
The Archivist is right there.
In terms of the movie, I sort of see William H. Macy as the Forbes Smiley character. That's the one that immediately springs to mind, with maybe Brad Pitt as the crusading investigative reporter, telling his story. And
Casting is being done as you speak.
In terms of the map that I would take, if I could. It would probably be a map from Yale that I uncovered during my research. It was by this gentleman by the name of John Seller, and there's only 3 copies in the world, and it was a very early map of New England, and it shows the area of New England around the time of King Philip's War. And so it's this really interesting map where there's all these pictures of colonists and Native Americans fighting each other, and it's this real kind of like glimpse in time to this area. And of course, being from New England, it's really particularly interesting to me. And the interesting thing about that map is that it's actually been stolen twice from Yale. That it was stolen back in the 70s, and was by another map thief who sold it, and it was recovered. And then Smiley came in and stole it again, and actually put a copy on his website. He actually colored the map, which was just particularly devastating given the fact there's only 3 of these things. He actually colored it, and he put it on his website, and in his description of the map said that there was a version at Yale that was uncolored, but that this was a different version, which was just really, the height of hubris that he would do such a thing. But the map itself is just really, really beautiful. I'd love to have it on my wall.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. If there's no more questions, really appreciate you coming, and I'm happy to sign any books that people may have.